Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear friends, I would like to begin by saying how honored I feel to have been invited by the University of Iasi to give a talk at this important World Lumen Congress 2021, celebrating 20 years of Lumen. For this celebration, I shall focus my speech on a problem of general ethics, the factory of false windows in law and in ethics, or symmetries and dissymetries of values. There exists in ethics many values that seem to enjoy full positivity, which is expressed by names, but which in reality hide either asymmetries or false balances between the very opposed values they pretend to reconcile, while this pretense turns out fruitless. Such is the case of three sorts of values that we want to study specifically: secularity, tolerance, and dignity. In promoting secularity and tolerance, the state intends to keep in each other's presence values opposing to a point of irreducible conflict, and to unite in a same community the persons who support them. The state succeeds in doing so by pretending to adopt an intermediate philosophy that, as Rouen said, does not imply any metaphysical position. In other words, this philosophy may be adopted by any citizen, whatever his or her own values. But this neutrality is evidently a counterfeit. It does not and cannot exist. Any value affirms positions of existence. If, in the name of secularity, the state imposes values, these values enter the game of powers with the others and must debate with them. We cannot say that they resolve their conflict simply because there is no such thing as philosophy that makes everyone agree, provided they be in good faith, leaving aside all the other texts in bad faith, under pretense that they would refuse such a deal. Nothing is simpler for a man that displays a certain ethical nihilism than accepting these intermediate values. Nothing is more difficult, on the contrary, than doing the same for these that have strong values whose requirements are well defined. Similarly to the effort of secularity, the effort of tolerance appears to be greater for some than others. Should one accept this situation and stand by it? Or should the inequity of effort among citizens be taken into account? However, how to get there when it seems that the systems of separation of churches and state, of beliefs from their acting out, are starting to show their limits? Would it not be possible to get out the intermediate values of hypocrisy in radically changing the essence of the law and the nature of our relation to law. If security and tolerance generally raise similar issues, dignity poses different problems. Dignity affirms that every human being has the right to be respected. But first, under the abstract and steady label of dignity, society is satisfied with a dynamic set of compensations. Man can mistreat man and disregard their dignity without their dignity being affected if those who are mistreated react with dignity to their mistreatment. Second, a racist, sexist, unequal behavior may persist alongside an affirmation of dignity if we are convinced that the individuals we mistreat are inferior to the men entitled to discuss dignity. Such is the case of David Hume, who, although he is the author of a Greek discourse on the dignity of human nature, of which he supports the value even in its illusions, displays without any embarrassment his racism against blacks when the evidence is given to him that a worthless successor to Newton, as at Cambridge, can have black skin. It is a case of Francis Williams. The problem is not that of dignity, but it is to know who may benefit from it and on what to trigger the notion. Let's not forget that it took more than 50 years after the Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights for the French Republic to abolish slavery. During all this time interval, the contradiction did not seem so exorbitant to most people who lived in the first half of the 19th century. Society can feel self-righteous by highlighting such values as dignity and yet by putting up with what we view as amazing contradictions. These contradictions can function durably so long as none of us implementing them notices. Fruitlessness is for Hume a condition for the proper functioning of values. By selecting these values, security, secularity, tolerance, and dignity, we do not mean that they are the only ones likely to fulfill the definition of dissymetries and false balance, more or less hidden under names. What is done in a different way depending on the language. The present analysis could be extended to many other values like respect or ethical behavior like consent. We only expect to show that in a very large number of cases, values, which their supporters take care to appear well balanced, are really underpinned by imbalances denied with such a success that even very wise philosophers get caught up in them and keep only one side of the notions they use. Dignity is relative to shame. Somebody is undignified who displays a shameful behavior without feeling the slightest touch of shame, or who knows how to prevent shame, how to curb it and circumvent the beginnings of shame. One can keep dignity, whereas one is treated shamefully. Shame is everywhere as a ghost. Such is a point Sartre forgot. He describes shame as one of the most acute feelings, one of the most painful, the feeling that makes us feel the best of our existence for others. But shame may be involved in situations where it never occurs as an experience feeling. In any case, not in another form than that of a representant of shame, which is worth for it. Shame may be an affect that one of the agents of the situation is waiting from another as what should be felt at the place and the role she is in. But that this other does not necessarily feel and even does not dream of feeling at all. Whomever sees him or her act like these fancies that he or her would feel ashamed if he or she were in his or her place. But nothing can prove it. So, in such circumstance, and it is not the only one, an affect, though felt by nobody, precisely because of its absence itself, and being never where it is expected, is able to saturate all the position of a situation. I can say before an act that loathes me, it's a shame, or it's shameful. I do not feel the slightest attack of shame, and I do not wait for anybody to feel it. What is real in this affect is less to be felt than the necessity to be situated in relation to this affect, than the fact to treat it as a money or to make it circulate incessantly like the words in a language. Not to be in a position to have this feeling, or only by delegation in place of others, such is a rule. The shamefulness is the indication of the place where shame should be felt. The fact that it is not felt being precisely a constituent of what is shameful. If Sartre has written the phenomenology of the vivid erlebnis of shame, Aristotle analyzed the shamefulness as chiseled in a chiseled way. If shame and shameful seem the closest possible terms, the modes of being they designate are the most distant. Shameful being something to have constantly a strategy toward shame, shame being the affect likely to burst beyond all strategy and reducing it to nothing. Several times we will have heard the term place, to be in place, to take place, etc. The game of dignity, which is that of shame and shamefulness, is deeply that of sympathy, understood in the sense of Hume and Smith, later criticized by Bentham. Through sympathy, we believe we are in unison with each other, whatever he or she be in a position to abuse or be abused, with what he or she experiences, situated he or she is, with what he or she should feel. In reality, this unison is never obtained, not even the slightest sketch. Only an effective image arises that we take for an affect and that we imagine being able to accommodate in the place occupied by the other. So there is a forgery of the sympathy. Hume knows it very well without denying its social usefulness. Adam Smith believes that he could go further in showing that the affect we assign to another was less a copy than some sort of resolution to the situation. If, for instance, in a given situation, somebody does not seem to feel the affect he should experience, everything happens as if I felt it in his place, and so as if I restored a compromise balance in the relations I witness. However, we must be careful. The false windows I build for this restoration remains a false one until the end and corrects nothing but seemingly. Nobody knows except myself what I have in mind when I replace the affect that the other seems to experience, and with which he should not be content with another affect that I produce by myself and that seems counterbalance the clear deficit I am witnessing. But this deficit remains in place without anything effectively moving. The decision to substitute is nothing but fictitious, and yet without the word being changed, except through the idea I have of it, I recover some trust in this word. It would have been easy to lose. Sympathy is a fabric of false windows that allows to bear the reality by pretending to transform it, to counterbalance its injuries, for example, without really changing anything. That does not mean that nothing should ever be changed, but that there are fictitious changes which in many situations are sufficient. Let's move to the functioning of secularity and tolerance that let the state develop a philosophy which refuses to be treated as one philosophy among others, which it is really, but pretends to be the ordinary philosophy of people of good faith, almost without them knowing it. A philosophy that fades away, so that once the other ideology, dogmas, moral tenets have been reduced to the same denominator, the state can pretend to claim not to pursue other goals than to allow everyone, whatever their religious options, to live in harmony with others for reasons that are not those of their opinions. but also in the way such that a return cannot be made to the state, would be obliged to explain oneself to spokespersons of ideologies, religions, moral, of which it wants to prevent the act, if not the silence, to silence the speeches and the writing. However, the treatment of tolerance and secularization by Sessions and Katz has its limits. The separation of the cases on which the state must rule from those on which it lets the churches rule is much less simple than it seems, and several problems make this cut illusory. Moreover, the ordinary way the state demands to every citizen to make a cut between the thinking, talking, teaching, and what it is doing, between the symbolic and the acting out, is equally illusory. Each citizen is split between contradictory demands. Some of them, because of an ordinary nihilism, have less to suffer from the split than the others. The only instance that is not split being the sovereignty of state was a monopoly of real action and tries to make people forget it rather than to face unequal treatment. The state subjects its citizens, in fact, in a number of them, to a regime from which it accepts itself. Begun under the auspices of Locke, the solution of tolerance and secularization problems become early Hobbesian. Hobbes had the merit to speak frankly. Can it be otherwise? Probably yes, if one abandons a contractual conception of the state, of the law, and of many other ethical designs which work on the same model. Bentham's reader is often surprised by the unexpected amalgamation of the author that treats in the same way a thinker who gives an important role to sympathy, moral sense, or common sense, and a contractualist who hardly uses sympathy or moral sense. The reason is that all these intellectual attitudes pretend to be able to count on the agreement of another, of any other, provided he or she be of good faith. The height of this attitude is reached by contractualists, which cannot hide disagreements between citizens, but imagine they can compensate for them by laying behind the contract that cannot clear them another agreement, suppose able to blur them. Unanimously, we would assume that majority rule erases differences and makes that my true will is the general will, even though I would disagree with it. Is this hypocrisy that we call fabric of false windows inevitable? Can I agree to abstain from values that seem to me the most essential? ones? Or can I accept, if I am not personally convinced by essential values, that others are forced to abstain, being forced to be free, according to the famous phrase of the contrat social, social contract of Rousseau. The ideological erasure of disagreements does not possibly strike me as a good thing. It creates very unequal citizens that makes them unhappy, or others witnesses of his inequalities, what makes them equally unhappy. It may be that Bentham's definition of the law that deals exactly with the question of adherence to the law contains some components to of the solutions. I read it. A law may be defined as an assemblage of things declarative of a volition, conceived or adopted by the sovereign in a state, concerning the conduct to be observed in a certain case by a certain person or class of persons, who, in the case of question, are or are supposed to be subject to his power. Such volition, trusting for its accomplishment to the expectation of certain events, which it is intended with such declaration, should upon occasion be a means of bringing to pass, and the prospect of which it is intended should act as a motive upon those whose conduct in question. First of all, the law is made up of an entanglement of adherences and reluctances, as long as adherences outweigh reluctances. Even resistances, the text of the law is the law. However, every citizen must realize and conveniently remember that the law to which he adheres is not accepted by everyone, but that everyone submits to law as long as the interplay of forces is favorable to adherences. This way of thinking the efficiency of law, rather than its ideal strength obtained by contract, should inspire our attitude towards sympathy, common sense, moral sense. Without going to rejections, which is often impossible, this attitude should not hold phantasm or of intersubjectivity as realities upon which we can rest. The desire takes often intersubjectivity for reality. It is indeed a constitutive illusion of society, but in which we must not indulge unsuspectingly. Will it be claimed that Bentham's definition of the law conceals a contract, as the contract disguises conflict in unanimity? Certainly not. For the foreignty that relies on the loyalty and trust of a majority for such and such a law is less contractualist nature is less of a contractualist nature, like in Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, then it depends on the habit of obedience. However, let us not believe that the probabilistic and statistical conception that we forward as a constituent of the law and the adherence to the law is a perfect and definitive solution, even if it has advantages over a contractualist solution. If I had more time, I would have shown you some difficulties of the probability calculation that cannot blur the dissymmetry of which I have talked. Our work, of which we will present one aspect, consists of being vigilant about dissymmetries, false symmetries, false windows that circulate underneath and through values rendered deceptively stable because they are designated by nominal entities. Let us not believe that this work merely holds theoretical reach. Its practical value is to denounce as fallacies the dissymmetries described above. However, we must pay attention to the fact that a critical and conceptual work, though it must overcome immediate depreciations, cannot be substituted to them without care. It is not impossible that, if we set aside in order to fight them the perverse games of racism, sexism, colonialism, economic inequality, it may be necessary to grant some unconscious leeway to values in order to keep a tension between those values as they appear along with our production, which follows quite another logic. Thank you for your attention.